we have long since come to the point where we have concluded that the best way of dealing with entry hazards is to just ignore them. And in the past, this might have meant, oh, you just make a good offensive team that overwhelms the opponent before they can overwhelm you with hazards. And I'm not talking hyper offense where it's like no switching, just set up and blast through everything. No, just a standard bulky offense team that doesn't necessarily need spin or hazard prevention, but can just function even in the face of hazards, if you're playing well. And these teams are still very much around and very viable. But what I mean when I say ignoring hazards is making teams that can really go the distance, because in the face of aggressive hazard stacking, which is really, really difficult to stop, even a good player wielding such an offensive team that can hang with these kinds of things, it's a tough task to pull off consistently. So when you are just dealing with hazard stacking, then today we're exploring how we got to this point. Because previously you would either remove the hazards with rapid spin or defog, or you would try and use an offensive team that try to prevent them at all costs. And this doesn't just mean Stealth Rock taunt leads, although that is the most obvious example. But no, what I mean by ignoring is basically trying to put the ability Magic Guard on your team as much as possible. And I don't just mean this with literal Magic Guard Pokemon, but in terms of Pokemon that have amazing longevity in the face of hazards. This concept predates the existence of Magic Guard. Superman in Advance, what else is that but teams built to just ignore spikes? You can have your 3 layers with your Skarmory as much as you want, it's not going to do anything, or it will do markedly less than it would against a different kind of team. So the issue, well, if it is an issue, I guess, is that a lot of metagames skew towards these balanced states where, whether or not it's an issue, I leave up to you. There's a lot of debate about this. It's about these balanced states, which some people can feel is stagnant, other people can feel like is a natural competitive conclusion. I'm personally more in the latter camp than I am the former, but I understand both. And you've got entire teams just dedicated to ignoring hazards altogether. So what else does Magic Guard mean if not literal Magic Guard? Well, obviously you're going to have as much of your Clefable and your Reuniclus and Alakazam as you can get, right? But people have even used Kadabra in Black and White. That one didn't last though. But yeah, no, more of what I'm referring to is Pokemon that have amazing longevity in the face of hazards. Like Poison Heal Gliscor has long been considered a pseudo Magic Guard Pokemon, not just because it is immune to Sandstorm and Spikes and Toxic Spikes, obviously, and it immediately heals off Stealth Rock, and it's immune to status because it poisons itself and it wants to be poisoned, so you can't burn it or anything. So, yeah, like technically it is affected by Leech Seed and stuff, and Stealth Rock does affect it, but it is on that level of immortality. Regenerator Pokemon also definitely qualify because they don't necessarily ignore this passive damage, but they have really good longevity with it. So they can hang for a long time, which is the whole goal. Because you are against these like hyper aggressive hazard stacking things, they also have good defensive cores. Those kinds of teams, they excel in getting the hazards early and then sit back on the defensive core until the opponent is ready to be finished off, whether because they run themselves out of options because their team just can't go the distance, or because they're too weak to too weak to handle your fast offensive threat waiting in the back. Or even when I say fast offensive threat, generally things like Aerodactyl in Advance come to mind, or DPP Jirachi, but it can even be something that's not immediately super threatening, like a Calm Mind Mega Latios. And on the subject of the Latios, then they also absolutely qualify because they are Spikes immune and they have recovery. So you've got Latios Gen 4, Latios Gen 5, sometimes Dual Lati Gen 5, and then you've got Mega Latios in 6 and 7, and sometimes Mega Latios in 7. And you've got other Pokemon like Bronzong. And then obviously in Gen 8, this whole concept comes to a head with the addition of Heavy Duty Boots, and now everything has Pseudo Magic Guard, especially with Regenerator. Although I was doing some research on this recently, and teams are not spamming Boots like in the quantities of like 4 that they used to. Yeah, in Gen 9 it's a different story, but that's, again, the whole hazard thing. And that is kind of the crux of the whole debate, right? It's, well, you've got these teams that are settling into these fully ignore hazard styles. And is that not healthy because hazards are good for checking things? And then you kind of wonder, well, isn't the issue that hazards are kind of busted to begin with? I mean, not that the concept of punishing switching is unhealthy inherently, but that it might have gone too far. No, it's not just a Stealth Rock thing either. Spikes can be just as nasty. I mean, I don't really... Look at the difference between GSC and other generations, for example, Oh, and the concept of the pseudo Magic Guard Pokemon, it doesn't even have to be a hazard immune one, or particularly hazard resilient one, as long as it can go the distance. This has precedent going back to before Magic Guard even existed, because something like on Superman teams, you will often see Jirachi, Wish Jirachi, Tyranitar, Swampert. These Pokemon are very good at staying healthy for a long period of time, even when they are affected by spikes, because they are sand immune and very bulky. And Swampert heals with Protect, and Jirachi has Wish and Protect. T-Tar is the least longevity focused of those, but it's still a Pokemon that can hang in the long game. So the exception on those teams is Blissey, which is sometimes used. It is affected by both Sand and Spikes, but it still falls into that pseudo Magic Guard principle because it is so unaffected by most damage that it doesn't have to immediately heal. And Soft Boiled is such reliable recovery that you are also not getting worn down quickly. That's the whole point. And it's especially accentuated by Wish. So, if you're running Wish Blissey anyway, which I think you often should. Anyway, so that's where we are now. And we were not always like this. We would see just all sorts of teams. I mean, we all knew how powerful the hazards were, of course. But the change really began because I remember in Generation 4, there was this idea that every spiking team needed a ghost type. Because why would you let one turn of Rapid Spin undo all your turns setting up rocks and spikes? And it was kind of like a good player secret that this didn't necessarily need to be the case. And I mean, it was also contentious because Gengar was not exactly a good spin blocker in the face of Starmie and Fortress, especially defensive Payback Fortress. But it was still used because it was such a great hazard abuser, and it still gave you that ghost type to pivot into. But yeah, by that logic, every spiking team should have also automatically had Rotom. Not that it didn't already tend to do that, but yeah. So you had all these super spiking teams because spikes are obviously super powerful, and the battle wound up being very much about navigating Rapid Spin if you were going to, because if you wanted to use a stall team or a defensive team in general, then Rapid Spin was a must. There were very few exceptions. Zach91 had a very early Superman team back in the original Lottie Ments metagame. It was Bronzong, Skarmory, Gliscor, Rotom, Latios, and Blissey. Blissey really applying that Superman Advance principle there. Yeah, with this in mind, a lot of games were involved in Fortress Wars, and Fori was very, very popular because it's a sturdy spinner, And then even once Fortress started falling out of favor, then we had Starmie Wars going on for a long time, and people were so utterly terrified of hazards that they were throwing around. They were throwing their Starmie into the game immediately, just to get that spin-off because they couldn't even handle dealing with Stealth Rock. And it's like, oh, it impedes my ability to switch. The way I saw it was once they got a taste of what it was like to... Because Starmie was not always super popular as a spinner, because most of the time you were seeing these teams that were just kind of like, oh, just execute your game plan and you'll kind of inherently be fine against hazards. And then, because Fortress was really just for like bulkier stuff. Yes, it could be used on more offensive teams, but generally leaning more towards semi-stall, stall, bulk. So a lot of teams did not really go for the whole spinning route. And then, once Fortress started falling out of favor, because the number one Stealth Rocker was Heatran, post Latias and Salamence, and then Starmie started popping up because it's an amazing answer to standard Stealth Rock Heatran. And against a lot of teams, you could just permanently keep rocks off. And obviously, this was an adaptation. This had to be adapted to, rather. But once people realized, oh, this feels so good not having to deal with Stealth Rock. This is absolutely amazing. And then they kind of overdid it by throwing Starmie into every Stealth Rocker, and just sacrificing it on turn 5, 6, 7, just to get rocks off for like 3 turns before Swampert comes in and pops them back up. So... that was another reason why Swampert actually came back, because in the grass-laden post-Latias metagame, if the music can play, please, then people were like, oh, I don't want to use Swampert. There's all these Breloons and Shamans around everywhere. And then when Starmie started spinning on Heatran all the time, people were like, actually, Starmie's not a very good spinner into Swampert. Let's use Swampert some more. So that was a big advantage, because that still is a dynamic present, but... you really had to have some sort of plan for maintaining your hazards. It wasn't just, oh, I click rocks and there they are forever. You either run a very, very offensive team, or you have a Stealth Rocker who matches up well against the spinners, so you can switch in and pop rocks up over and over again. This is why I really like Stealth Rock Celebi, because with HP Fire, you threaten both Starmie and Fortress. And even the occasional Hitmontop, that was actually used back then. Nowadays, you're actually good into Donphan, which is a legitimate choice now. So, that's the basic. And this was a tenet of many metagames. I mean, I'm using DPP as the example here, but it applied very much so in the other generations as well. Around this time that I'm describing this, Fortress Wars were all over the place in Advance and Black and White. Because, I got to spin. How do you deal with hazards? I spin. Not every team can be Superman. Before people realized, yeah, it kind of can. If you want to be optimal in the long game anyway. If you're going to... That was the whole reason why this whole spin to win thing collapsed, because the hazard setters are so good, and their teammates are so good at taking advantage of the spin. If you rely on spin... against a team that's just going to focus on stacking their hazards and outlasting you, the spin side is just, wasted effort. And that kind of unnecessary exertion is just holding you back. I mean, yes, Starmie's a good Pokemon and all, but if you're going the distance, you got to just ignore it as much as possible. The hazards, I mean. And this was the case in many generations where people asked, why would I spin with Fortress when I could just ignore with Skarmory, who's also a much better Pokemon? Black and White, we obviously had the Magic Guard Revolution. Gen 6, people were like, at first in XY, people didn't want to use spikes because, defog. And then people realized, the defoggers are actually terrible, which is how Gen 6 eventually, and multiple times, Gen 6 has wound up in spike stacking hazard immune wars with Clef, Gliscor, Zam, Reuniclus, Megalodios, all that jazz. Skarmory, of course. So that's the basic idea, that if you are trying to spin, then you will get outlasted. But previously, this was the very present dynamic. This was a reason why Stealth Rock T-Tar became so effective for a long time in DPP as well, because you would match up well against Fori and Starmie. So... that was a pressure point against defensive teams. First you get the rocks, and then you pressure them. And because they have a lot of pressure points, and I'm not just talking about this old Stealth Rock weak Pokemon like Gyarados, but even something like Blissey. If you have rocks and sand and you start double switching on the Blissey, suddenly you do that enough times and it's going to get uncomfortable and you can make something happen. And nowadays the teams are so, not just Spike's resilient, but even Rock's resilient, that that's just the very first step. Whereas before it was you get rocks and you're already going very far. The rise of something like Wish Protect Jirachi, which does not care about Stealth Rock almost at all, is very much a response to these kinds of offensive teams, which is bowl over stall by either getting up rocks and pressuring them, or by pressuring them, with setup sweepers, the hyper offense stuff, or just the bulky offense stuff that likes getting up rocks and then double switching a whole bunch. So that's why that kind of dynamic is not as present anymore, because Jirachi is so good at shutting down these kinds of offensive teams, because it just kind of sits in front of everything and outlasts. And outlasting is kind of what the whole hazard-centric deal has become. And I guess this is a little memorial for the day. I mean, I'm not going to say that spin is still not good. I mean, even on offensive teams, or especially on offensive teams, but it's not as much of a goal, just because you have to exert pressure in addition to spinning. Previously the spin was so big that you would just do everything possible to get that spin off. And, pursuit support for the ghosts, of course. And this is why T-Char was also so popular, because not every Stealth Rocker is going to be good into Starmie, of course, or Fortress, but let's say Starmie, because that really was what was ruling the metagame for a while, and Fortress started lagging behind a lot. And, okay, so you want to use Stealth Rock Heatran because it's a great Pokemon. Okay, what are you going to do about Starmie? Yes, you can run something like Pasho HP Grass. That'll be good. But that's not going to be the case for every team. Okay, so you pursued it. Whether it's with Scizor or more commonly T-Tar. And this is why Pursuit Tar was so popular for such a long time, because you just... you get up rocks, you force the spin, you trap the Starmie, all is well. And so many dynamics came out of that. Bold Starmie, Reflect Starmie. I even ran Protect a few times. It was pretty cool. But it was all about, you get rid of the spinner so you maintain your hazards. You get rid of the opposing ghost so that you can spin away their hazards. And it's all about this. And it was a very interesting part of the metagame, for sure. You had to really think ahead to get the most out of it. But it was... yeah, it just completely collapsed under Clefable and friends, Gliscor, Bronzong, that kind of stuff, just saying, you know what, we don't actually care about this at all, and we'll just pressure you. You spin away the hazards, okay, we'll just wind up removing it. This kind of, you don't need ghosts to deal with spinners thing, started coming about more popularly in Black and White, because the Rotom appliances were no longer ghost. It's like, oh, well, the easiest spin blocker in the world is no longer with us. Okay, yes, Jellicent is very good, and Jellicent was used a lot, but it's not quite the super spammable Pokemon Rotom is. And Gengar was used too, but also not exactly the most reliable spin blocker. So, more of a hazard abuser that can also spin block in a pinch. So, with that in mind, people are like, you know what? I'll just beat the spinners, because the spinners are super flawed into these new hazard setters, mainly Ferrothorn. So it became a much newer dynamic in Black and White. This was very, very rare in DPP at the time of the current gen anyway. In Black and White, you would see hazards laid and then spun away and then relayed multiple times per game. And I'm not just talking about, rain games with Tentacruel being immortal. No, I'm talking, Starmie and sometimes even Spin Excadrill. And in DPP, the whole reason there was that emphasis on the ghost was because it felt like you spend all these turns getting up those hazards, and then you get that spin off, and if they get that spin off, then it feels like the game is over. So much pressure was coming just from the hazards on spiking teams anyway, because isn't that what you're dedicating yourself to, the spikes? And then eventually, and this whole hazard stacking and repeated hazard stacking, I should say, that came about in Black and White. This was way before, Magic Guard spam was thought of. I mean, yes, people were using Reuniclus, but Magic Guard Alakazam didn't even exist yet. So, and I mean, forget Clefable. So a lot of the teams in Black and White and DPP for a long time resembled each other. Hippo, Spidef Heatran, Scarf T-Tar, Fortress, Bulky Starmie, Skarmory. And sometimes you would just replace the water type. Jellicent in Black and White obviously doesn't transfer over to Gen 4, but neither does the Rotom appliance in Gen 4 over to Gen 5, because it's used as a ghost. So, Gliscor, obviously. So, yeah, with all that in mind, then this is kind of the push that led us into this whole hazard-ignoring direction. And now where we've gotten to the point where it's just... I mean, yes, Goldengo in Gen 9, doing the whole spin block, defog block thing is silly, but just, raise the question, are hazards busted? I mean, I've asked that question before, and this is not really what that video is about, but it is a consideration that has to be made, just because of how powerful they are. Sometimes I really wonder if spikes should be limited to 2 layers. Because 1 layer, I understand. Multiple layers is fine. But 3 is just so... 25% is just so much. And I've also made a video on why the 2nd layer of spikes kind of sucks. So, if you can't get the 3rd, that is. Obviously, more damage is good. So, by maxing out that 2nd layer, then you have more damage, obviously, but you are not really operating on any sort of busted plane. But yeah, so you've got this, a lot of these teams were resilient in the face of hazards, but they also really liked spin. So it wasn't just like, you get that spin off in 6 turns or you're toast. But also, whoever was managing their hazards and their spin, I mean, a lot of games had the spin not actually be pulled off, because even something like Starmie, I remember this dynamic. I was a big fan of this, where you would knock Starmie down to low health. It would be within range of rocks and spikes, and then you would spin block it with your Rotom. It's like, okay, well, I KO'd the Rotom, and now Starmie is super fast. Very little is actually going to outspeed it, so even if I faint now, I will still get that spin off. And then a faster Pokemon comes out and spin blocks it, not by literally spin blocking it, but just by KOing it. And it can't switch out because then it will crumple the hazards. So there's the music. I used to use Aerodactyl a lot for this purpose. And for those of you who are watching the replay on the screen, then that is exactly what happened in this battle. I will link the replays in the pinned comment for anyone who is interested in perusing them at their own leisure, and for those who would like to see them but have me on in their car or wherever. So, with spin in mind, then it just eventually, it felt like so much of the metagame was the dance between spin and ghosts and pursuit. And in fact, it was what, it wasn't just DPP either. Again, Advance. When Advance started being played widely again in Smogon Tour in 2011, a lot of the player base they saw the power of spikes, obviously, and they thought of it, in very DPP terms almost. Because they were saying things like, or they weren't saying this, but this was the general idea, that they were, how shall I phrase this? They were so, remember that whole thing I was saying about how they were so scared of dealing with just rocks in DPP that they would throw Starmie away immediately? Well, it's kind of the same idea in in Advance. Because they saw the power of spikes, and yes, they knew Superman was a thing, but Fortress did not used to be a thing in Advance, and part of this was the net battle glitch where sub blocked spin, so why bother spinning when you could just ignore? Or use a good team that can just fight in the face of hazards, of course. That was also very prominent. But yeah, people suddenly got this idea, oh, well, what if we used Fortress because it can spike and also spin, because that was the mindset of dealing with hazards. You rapid spin them away. So that is why Fortress became the defining spiker. It was way more popular than Fortress when Advance was in Smogon Tour, and it took a while for Skarmory to come back, and now obviously Skarmory is the king by a mile. But yeah, that was and then the whole, okay, well, Gengar previously was used because it was a Spikes abuser, not so much because it was a rapid spinner. I mean, Gengar plus Spikes is just a great combination, but when people aren't spinning, you're as much because of the whole sub-block spin thing, and spin is not as much a part of the metagame, and you're going to just be dealing with the spinners just by virtue of the fact that, Skarmory outlasts them so well. So you use Gengar on these teams because it is a great Spikes abuser, not because it is blocking spin so much. But suddenly, now in Advance, then you've got the whole dynamic of Gengar blocks Fortress spin. Oh, what do I do? Oh, Pursuit Tar, another Pokemon that was not used in Advance's heyday. To remove Gengar, yes, because Gengar's a big threat, but at the time, nowadays you would see, at the time, it was, I need to remove Gengar so I can spin. Nowadays, it's just, I gotta get rid of that Gengar because it will ruin me otherwise, because Gengar is insane. But yeah, that's how it came to be. Not just let's remove Gengar, but let's remove Gengar to spin. And before we get into the other aspect of dealing with hazards, the prevention, I'll also mention that whole make sure your hazard setter has a good matchup into the spinners thing. I mean, that's been around since GSC, of course. If you're running Cloyster in GSC, then you like to run Toxic, so when Starmie shows up, you can actually do something to it beyond just exploding. And you take out the Starmie, but you lose your spikes, so net positive for the Starmie user generally. With Toxic, you can play the long game, outlast it, maintain your spikes. Fortress likes HP Fire sometimes for other Fortress, and both GSC, and sometimes this was even used in Advance. HP Bug Fortress is its calling card because Stab HP Bug lets you actually mess with Starmie, both GSC and Advance. And in Advance, you also have it for Claydol. HP Ghost Foray is also decent in this regard, mostly against Claydol. But, and in GSC, or no, it doesn't use Ghost in GSC. No, it can. I take that back. It can. For Gengar, mostly, and Missy. But yeah, in Advance, it can do it as well. But yeah, you are, even Skarmory, for example, previously it was using Toxic Protect, and with Toxic Protect, bulky Starmie is going to get forced out, you'll beat that, and then Claydol started running Refresh, and people wanted to run Skarm without Gengar just to free up team building, and so that's where Drill Peck came into place, because with Drill Peck you will eventually wear Fortress down, and Claydol will lose to you in the long run. But that also means you have to have something in consideration for Bulky Starmie, because Bulky Starmie does beat Toxic-less Drill Peck Skarm one-on-one. So, I mean, there's plenty of ways to do that. Gengar, Pursuit Tar, Dugtrio. Yeah. And what was the other thing? Yeah, sometimes you even run Phaseless Skarmory, and you run Spikes, Protect, Toxic, Drill Peck. Great set. Not for every team, but great set. So, yeah. So now the other element I wanted to mention was prevention, and this one is also reliable, if grain of salt, because obviously it is a lot more difficult to pull off consistently if your opponent knows it's what you like, which is again why we so often default to this whole hazard immunity thing. But with in the right matchups, then you will see all sorts of things. Like, let's say Scarf Breloom. And this goes back to something like, it's Taunt, it's Sleep, it's threatening an early KO, for example, in Gen 5 NU. Then Sawk, with its Mold Breaker ability, would threaten an Oko on Golem lead with CB Close Combat. And Golem has Sturdy, but Mold Breaker bypasses Sturdy. So that was an early form of hazard control, hazard prevention, to threaten with Sawk like that. And Golem leading off an offensive team is not going to want to switch into that CB Close Combat right off the bat. Haha, there's a Crobat on the screen. So you don't even have to lead with the Sog. It's just the threat of it. So obviously Sleep is there, Taunt is there, Okos are there. And in DPP for a while, there are these attacking leads, Dragonite, Empoleon, Metagross, Machamp, where you weren't preventing Stealth Rock, but you were punishing the opponent for getting up Stealth Rock and making them play 6-5. I mean, these offensive teams do count on that, but it's ideal if you can get a little more out of the lead than just rocks, But yeah, Azelf being the most popular Stealth Rock taunt lead leads Scarf T-Tar to start running Stealth Rock, so you can't even prevent that. That makes Aerodactyl more popular, so the prevention aspect is not always the most reliable. I mean, in the past, this is not even a recent thing. Back in like 2009, 2010, you would sometimes see Stealth Rock Scarf Heatran. You just pop up those rocks against Taunt, Azelf, and Arrow. So, and then you switch out, obviously, but you've gotten the rocks against a team who relies on the lead to not get the rocks. But yeah, these are not just hyper offense tactics. I mean, you've got Scarf Breloom, that was a popular thing. And that reminded me of Scarf Venusaur being used. I mean, it's still a great Pokemon. It's still used in DPPUU, but it was especially important during the Frostlass metagame because Frostlass was such a dominant Spikes lead that you really could not reliably stop it besides Scarf Venusaur or Sleep. And obviously, accuracy and sleep rolls make that kind of contentious, but it was pretty much as good as you were going to get. So, and it was pretty reliable, all things considered. So, yeah, you've got the prevention aspect as well. But the prevention aspect only really works for really offensive teams, and sometimes it's good to have a mix. For example, in Advance, there was a T-Tar set. It's still a great set. Taunt Toxic T-Tar, Rock Slide EQ. You can also go Crunch Pursuit, but Rock Slide EQ is generally safer. And it is the one way for T-Tar to completely deny Skarmory from spiking early on. And then they switch in like a Swampert after, you Toxic it, it's great, you're in a good spot. But eventually, the thing is with Advance is that the prevention aspect doesn't really work as well. I mean, some teams, yes. If you're just on the ball, doubling to your Mata Zapdos and executing special offensive pressure, yes. But eventually you are going to Dugtrio or something, Skarm will get that lair. So the prevention aspect isn't really a permanent thing so much as just long enough for the offensive plan to get executed. So you can go with prevention either to do that, or you can go with prevention mixed with some relief. And those Taunt Toxic T-Tar teams, they were generally more balanced. They were not hyper-offensive. The prevention in terms of, let's keep the Advance example, Zapdos special offense, then Zapdos is preventing or punishing in the case of Fortress with sub-passing. Then you're luring in the special wall, removing it, and then spikes are not quite as powerful in Advance because they don't hit anything super effectively, so in a shorter game they're less valuable. With a defensive team anyway. So those spikes are not really guarding you against the eventual Super Rachi sweep, for example. But yeah, that's the offensive way. Prevention mixed with punishing them for spiking, And because once Dugtrio has removed something, it has removed a special wall, so you don't care about the spikes because your Zapdos is back in. Now the Taunt Toxic T-Tar route, then that is usually mixed with Spinner. Starmie is very popular there. Because this is not a hard and fast rule, but generally on those balanced kinds of teams, then you remove or you block the spikes early so you can execute your offense. Toxicking the Pert, that's going to pay dividends later. And you have Taunt, so it even messes with Pert's attempts to refresh if it even has it, so it's great. But Scarb will get that spike off against a moderately paced team. That's the whole concept of this whole thing. No matter the spikers will get their spikes off, and they will outlast your hazard prevention, or just outright remove it. I mean, in Gen 6, have fun switching in your Defog Latios or Latios to, get rid of hazards. And there's Pursuit T-Tar, goodbye, and now the hazards are back in like 3 turns. So you basically just did nothing. You wasted a slot. So, mixing this prevention aspect with some relief. I mean, again, Starmie, it's a lot better to use Starmie nowadays, not as a Pokemon that you rely on to keep hazards off forever, but just once. And the difference between doing that now and the way it was done before is before it was, if you get that spin off, all their pressure collapses and you win just by default because you're beating them with your own hazards. Nowadays, it's more, I get the spin off and that relieves enough pressure for me to execute the rest of my offensive game plan. It's similar to Claydol offense and advance. Claydol is famously not going to keep Hazards off permanently against Skarm, but it resets the pressure that Skarm is exerting on the Claydol team, so suddenly you can get some health back on Metagross, or you're limiting how much damage you're taking. Even if it's just for a turn, going from 2 or 3 layers to no layers for a turn as you switch to whatever you're switching to, and then only having to deal with 1 if whatever you switch to is forcing the Skarm out, which it should, then that is a major, major difference. So thinking of Starmie in those terms helps a lot. On offensive teams, I'm a big fan of Trick Specs Starmie, and just because you blast Specs Hydro, and if you need to get a spin-off with it to enable your Mix Knight or whatever, then go for it. It's really good. Or on even more balanced teams, then you have the prevention early on, because what you don't want to do is have a team that's vulnerable to getting Hazard stacked on very early, and then trying to patch that up with Starmie. No, what you want to do is you exert pressure, and you punish or prevent the Hazard stacking, and then later on, yes, even as much as you want to try and prevent or punish the Hazard stacking, it is still going to go off, it is still going to pressure you, and that's where you just need that temporary relief. That is what the goal is. So, yeah, that's basically it. And with, it's difficult to pull off. But that's why we see so much Excadrill spinning, because Excadrill's typing is so robust that it is the closest thing to a reliable spinner. And even then, obviously, you don't really do well into Rock's grounds, which are already great, Hippo, Gliscor, Lando T. But with Excadrill being the one Pokemon, or one of the few Pokemon to actually gain health switching into Stealth Rock, then you are going to be able to do it over and over and over again. Yeah, you got to watch out for Rocky Helmet, especially when you're dealing with something like Skarm in Black and White, or Oris. But yeah, you see the point I'm making, where for not every team is going to be Magikarp Spike spam, but there's a reason why the concept has been thrown around in Black and White that all reasonable Black and White team building leads back to Spike's Reuniclus Calm Mind Wars, because it just winds up being the most robust, to use that word again. My old stats classes are running around in my head right now. The most robust against the whole metagame, and then the rest of the metagame ensues from trying to get a leg up on those specific Reuniclus teams. But as for taking on the metagame as a whole, the most reliable styles, which does mean Hazards, Reuniclus is not just an abuser of spikes, but also a response to them. Because previously, you go through this whole song and dance of, oh, it's so difficult to pursue and then spin, and my whole team's getting hacked apart by Hazards. It's like, well, why not just ignore it, especially when Reuniclus is such, and this applies to something like Clefable as well. Mega Latias has had similar effects, even though it's not literally like a Magikarp Pokemon. But yeah, it's like, why not just be immune to these and pressure them, because your counters are going to get worn down by spikes, and then you start looking to these specific non-spikes affected counters, which are very few, and and then you get the song and dance we have now of the whole spikes immune thing. Jesus Christ. Spikes immune playstyles. Yeah, this has been the history of how we got there, pretty much across the generations. So yeah, it makes you scratch your head and say, is this whole Hazard thing? I don't know. Recently in Black and White, there were genuine talks of removing or suspecting spikes. I hope it happens. I really think it would be good. I think, or Reuniclus, God. The thing with Reuniclus is that it actually makes spikes easier to deal with, but it also is one of the worst abusers of them, so who knows. It really feels like half the issues in the tier go away without spikes. It's not a new idea either. I remember when when Black and White UU was current, then you had all these spikers. You had Roserade and Deoxys D just spike. Yeah, Deoxys D was UU for those who didn't know. And it wasn't even that broken, crazily enough, but they were just spiking all over the place, and the metagame was so ransacked by spikes, people were wondering, should we not just suspect these? And there were these whole debates, oh, you can't suspect a move, all this dumb bureaucratic policy stuff. But yeah, so yeah, again, I'm linking the replays in the comment, in the pinned comment. But for this last replay, I picked it not just because August is running a hyper-offensive Stealth Rock Taunt lead team that prevents hazards first through fast taunt and then through offensive pressure, but also because TV Raka, his team with the Crobat lead and then Breloom Spore and offensive pressure from Infernape and Jirachi, that was also, and I think his T-Tar even had taunt, also a form of hazard prevention.